Hello and welcome to week 9 of Advanced Algorithms. In contrast to the last week where we talked about approximation, this time we are going to be talking about exact algorithms. So these are algorithms that do not compromise on the quality of the output. We are always looking for an accurate solution on all possible inputs, but you can probably predict that as long as we are in the regime of, for example, NP-complete problems, we now expect to compromise on the running times. So we are definitely going well beyond polynomial running times here. And just like in the regime of polynomial time algorithms, we try to ask ourselves, can we do better? We're going to do the same here. If the brute force algorithm is n factorial, we want to know, can we do it in, for example, 2 to the n? If the brute force approach is 2 to the n, we want to know, can we do it in 1.001 to the n, and so on. So basically the point here is that we are entering a regime of super polynomial running times, and our focus is going to be what's the best we can hope to achieve within that context. So if you're interested in the kinds of techniques that are involved in the design of such exact algorithms, then you might want to check out a textbook that goes by the title Exact Exponential Algorithms. It's by Foreman and Crash, and it's a part of the IITCS Texts in Theoretical Computer Science series. It's really an excellent and comprehensive overview of the modern techniques involved in the design of exact exponential algorithms. So with that said, I'm going to also point out that most of my presentation for this week is actually borrowed from a couple of chapters in the Parametrized Algorithms book, which is one of the official readings for this course. And you can find in the notes pointers to specific subsections which are related to what I'm talking about. So with that said, let's start off with, as promised, the maximum independent set problem. Let's just begin by recalling the definition of independent set, which you might remember from your previous encounters. It's essentially a subset of vertices in a graph that's mutually non-adjacent. So if I have a subset S of vertices and every pair of vertices in S is not an edge, then that's called an independent set. The complementary notion is a clique, where you say that between every pair of vertices you want an edge. So this is exactly the opposite of that. And in terms of set complement, you might remember that if S is an independent set, then V minus S is a vertex cover. So in some sense, those are notions that are dual of each other. So let's just maybe do a quick example to make sure that we are on the same page with respect to the definition. So here is a graph. Let me add in some labels here. So a possible independent set in this graph would pick the vertices P, Q, and R. Notice that you can now not pick Z because that's blocked out by all the choices that we've made so far. But we can pick X, that blocks out also Y and A. We can pick B, and that's one sort of an independent set that you can see is maximal, in the sense that I cannot build on this any further. I cannot add any more vertices to this while still maintaining that it's an independent set. Is this also a maximum independent set? Is this the largest that we could have hoped for? Well, in this example, you can sort of verify that's indeed the case. You could also come up with other independent sets that are maximal but not maximum. So for example, if I were to pick A and Z, that's an independent set of size 2 that's really stuck. I really cannot pick anything else. I cannot pick B and C because they're blocked by A. I cannot pick X and Y because they're blocked by Z, and that's also the case for P, Q, and R. So in some sense, this was a really poor choice if I want to maximize the size of my independent set, but it's nevertheless a valid independent set that's maximal. So our interest computationally is in the question of finding a largest independent set, or reporting the size of a largest independent set. So let's first think about baseline against which we want to do better. So what would be a completely naive brute force algorithm for this problem? Well, notice that it's a problem involving vertex subsets, so you could simply try all possible subsets of vertices. For each of them, examine if they form an independent set, and if they do, then you can basically register those as the potential sizes of the independent sets that are present in the graph, and simply report the largest that you encounter. So that would be an algorithm that takes 2 to the n time, along with some polynomial overhead to account for checking if a subset is an independent set and keeping track of the size. So this is what we want to improve on, because this is simply a fairly elementary brute force approach that just tries everything out. And what we are going to do is actually also something that has a brute force flavor. It's just that we are going to be a little more careful in terms of how we go about things. So we are again going to use a recursive algorithm. This technique is sometimes called branch and bound, because what we are going to do is branch over all possible scenarios. So that makes it exhaustive and brute force like. But on the other hand, it's going to be a controlled algorithm, because we are going to bound the amount of branching that we do. So how do we go about this? Well, let's begin by considering a vertex. Let me call this vertex V for now. This can just be your favorite vertex in the graph. You're not really constraining it, but we will come back to the choice of this vertex in just a bit. Now, as I suggested before, our approach here is going to be a bit of guided brute force. So here is the brute force aspect of what we are going to do. The simple observation here is that any maximum independent set of the graph G that we are working with either contains V or does not contain V. That's really a very simple statement that we are making here, and in fact, in some sense, this is what drives the naive brute force algorithm, because for every vertex, you're kind of trying to guess which is it. Does it belong or does it not belong? And that leads you to enumerating all possible subsets. But here we are going to try and see if we can build further on the possibility that a maximum independent set contains V. Because an independent set is an independent set, we know that if it contains V, then something more is also true. We know that if an independent set contains V, then it definitely does not contain any of its neighbors, because that's just how an independent set is by definition. We cannot afford to have edges inside our independent set. So the choice of putting V in our independent set automatically blocks out all of these choices, and we want to know if our algorithm can leverage this information. So what we're going to do is design a branching or a recursive algorithm, which basically gets into two parallel universes. In the first one, we say, well, what if G has a maximum independent set that does not involve V? Then that's easy. We just get rid of V from the graph, because we know that it's not going to play a role in our solution, and that's about it. So we try and find a maximum independent set in G minus V. We keep track of it, and we compare it against the other possibility, which is that V does belong to a maximum independent set. In this case, what we can do is not only get rid of V and add 1 to our solution, which we would do to remember the fact that we are including V in our solution, we can actually get rid of the entire closed neighborhood of V, because we know that they're not really going to play a role in the solution anymore. None of them can be legitimate choices for inclusion in our maximum independent set, right? So that's what we are going to be doing here. We are going to basically recurse on the graphs G minus V and G minus the closed neighborhood of V. And you can see that our recursive instances now are of varying sizes. So on the one hand, if we started off with a graph on n vertices, when we choose to not include V, then we design a graph that has only n minus 1 vertices, and on the other hand, when we choose to actually include v, then we are working with a graph that has n minus the degree of v plus 1 many vertices, which is actually n minus the degree of v minus 1. So for example, if v was a vertex with degree 5, then on the one hand you have a graph which has n minus 1 vertices, but on the other hand you have a graph which has n minus 6 vertices, which is a much smaller graph than what you started off with. And you can imagine that you want your recursion to actually end as soon as possible, because that's what's going to save you time. And as we have seen earlier, for example, when we were dealing with quicksort, the easiest way to sort of develop some intuition for what a recursive algorithm or a branching algorithm is doing is to look at the recursion tree that's naturally generated by that algorithm. So here we start off with a graph G, and then on the one hand we have G minus V, and here we have G minus the close neighborhood of V. And let's just build this out for one more step. So let's say at the first layer of recursion we choose a different vertex to branch on. So here let's say we chose the vertex U, so we get into G minus U and G minus the close neighborhood of U. And let's say here we picked a different vertex, maybe W. So we go to G minus W and G minus the close neighborhood of W. Like I said earlier, the vertex that you choose to branch on can be anything in terms of correctness. It really doesn't matter. You don't need this vertex to be special, because what you're doing here is completely exhaustive. But notice that the choice of vertex can influence the shape of this recursion tree. Take a pause here and think about what kind of vertices would be good for the recursion tree. And what do I mean by being good for the recursion tree? I want to know what kinds of choices lead to recursion trees that fizzle out faster. Notice that I want to race to the base cases and basically be done as quickly as possible, because the more the layers and the more instances that I have, the more work my algorithm is doing. That's sort of the high level intuition here. Also, speaking of base cases, what are the base cases here? The natural thing would be to say, well, if a graph just has one vertex, for example, then I simply return 1, because that's the size of the largest independent set in a graph that only has one vertex. But we could be a little more intelligent about our stopping condition. Notice that there may be several situations where we can actually determine the size of the maximum independent set in polynomial time. Some cases are so simple that we can actually compute the size of the largest independent set with just one pass over the graph. One such situation would be, for instance, if every vertex is degree at most 1. If that happens, then notice that every vertex in the graph is either isolated or participates in just one edge. So your entire graph basically looks like a matching and some isolated vertices. In such a graph, you can simply report the size of the largest independent set as being the number of isolated vertices plus the number of edges in the matching, because that's the best you can hope to do, and this is a pretty easy case. So we keep going for as long as we have vertices that have degree at least 2, and we stop once we know that all vertices have degree at most 1. So that would be a complete description of the algorithm. But take a moment here to think about what's the vertex that you should choose to branch on. Should it be vertices that have large degree, that have small degree? Does it make no difference? Or should it be some other criteria completely? Once again, just to help you think about this, remember that the total amount of work that's done by your algorithm can be thought of as the number of nodes in the recursion tree multiplied by the amount of work that happens at every node, right? So that's the overall cost. And in this particular algorithm, the amount of work that's done at every node is simply polynomial in n. All we are doing is identifying all the neighbors of a vertex, deleting them from the graph, And even when we come back from the recursive calls, in terms of reporting the answer, the work that we have to do is actually also fairly trivial, because notice that if, for instance, these instances come back with outputs k1 and k2, that is to say that the size of the largest independent set in G minus V is k1, and the size of the largest independent set is in G minus the closed neighborhood of V is k2, as reported by the recursive calls, then what you want to output here is the larger of these two options. So this might remind you of what we did when we were doing the dynamic programming on trees for finding the largest independent set. So here, when we are coming back from G minus V, we only have to work with K1. But when we are coming back from G minus the closed neighborhood of V, then we know that we actually add the vertex V to our solution. So it's whatever we got out of G minus the closed neighborhood of V plus 1 to account for the fact that the actual independent set is the union of whatever witnessed the value of K2 and the vertex V, which we can add without running into any issues because the neighbors of U were not there. Sorry, the neighbors of V were not there when we went into this recursive parallel universe. Okay, so basically the amount of work that's done at each node is only polynomial. So really the driving factor for the running time is going to be the number of nodes in this recursion tree. So we want to somehow control that as much as possible, make it as small as possible. So what kind of nodes should we be branching on? This would be a good time to take a pause and think about this a little bit. All right, so hopefully you did have a chance to take that pause, and welcome back to the conversation, which we are going to pick up from where we left off. So the idea is that if we manage to make the size of the graph become smaller as much as possible, then our recursion will fizzle out basically faster, because you're losing vertices rapidly and the graph is becoming smaller faster. So in some sense that controls basically the depth of the recursion tree. So we do want, wherever we do have control, to make choices that reduce the size of the instance more as opposed to less. So notice that in this left branch out here, we really don't have much control, because we are going to have to remove V and the size is going to go down by exactly 1. There's not much that we can do here. But on the other hand, here the size of the graph reduces by roughly the degree of the vertex, and therefore it would actually make sense to branch on vertices that have large degree. So let's always pick our vertex V to be the vertex of maximum degree, and we know that because we are going to bail out once the maximum degree of the graph reaches 1, we know that we are always branching on vertices that have degree at least 2. Because if you cannot find a vertex whose degree is at least 2, then that means every vertex is degree 1 or 0, but that we know how to deal with without branching any further. We just take care of it in one shot. So that's a base case. Therefore, we always have a vertex whose degree is at least 2, which means that the drop that we have in the size of the instance is going to be essentially, remember that that's n minus the degree of the vertex plus 1. So since the degree is at least 2, you're going to lose at least 3 vertices in this branch. Okay, so if we use T of n to denote the number of nodes in the recursion tree with an instance that has n vertices, then we know that that's going to be upper bounded by T of n minus 1 and T of n minus 3. And the reason for this is simply that on the one hand, we have a recursion tree which is starting off with an instance that has n minus 1 vertices, and on the other side, we have an instance which has at most n minus 3 vertices, right? So it can have even fewer if you were lucky with your choice of V. If it was an even higher degree vertex, then this would have even less than n minus 3 vertices. But certainly you'll never be in a situation where you have more than n minus 3 vertices. So that's going to be this recurrence. And one way that we usually solve recurrences is by sort of expanding it out, but here let's sort of use a slightly different approach where we make this claim up front to say that t of n is bounded by some constant to the power n. Okay, let's pretend that that's true for some constant, and if that was true, then we're left with an equation which looks like this. We know that c of n is at most c to the n is at most c to the n minus 1 plus c to the n minus 3, and if we were to divide that throughout by c to the n minus 3, then we have that c cubed is at most c squared plus 1. Now this turns out to be an equation that you can actually solve for c, and if you do that, then you're going to find that c is something like 1.46 or so, and that gives us an algorithm whose running time is 1.46 to the n, of course, times some polynomial overhead, right? So that's our first non-trivial, as in better than brute force algorithm for the maximum independent set problem. But notice that now you can probably try to ask the question that we should always ask ourselves, which is if we can do better. And notice that one of the reasons we had a drop of 3 in the second branch was because we were able to stop when the maximum degree of the graph was basically 1. So can we push our luck a little bit further and come up with an even more general stopping criteria? So for instance, what can we say if the max degree of the graph is at most 2? What will this buy us in terms of the analysis? Well, now instead of losing 3 vertices, you're guaranteed to lose 4 if you were able to stop when the maximum degree is at most 2. If that's a base case, then notice that you'll always have a vertex of degree 3 or more to branch on, and when you branch on a vertex of degree 3, then in the right branch you actually lose 4 vertices, right? So that's going to be our new analysis if we manage this nicer base case. Well, so let's talk about that base case. What happens when the maximum degree of the graph is at most 2? Well, in this case, if you think about it for a bit, you'll see that the graph is actually a collection of cycles, paths, and isolated vertices, which can be thought of as special kinds of paths of length 0. Right? So that's essentially what your graph looks like. And again, I'm going to leave the details as an exercise, but you can imagine here that finding a maximum independent set is easy. It's roughly going to be half the number of vertices. You have to be careful about whether it's a floor or a ceiling for each component depending on the situation. So for example, if it's a cycle and it's an even length cycle, then you have exactly half being the answer. But on the other hand, if it's an odd length cycle, then you only get the floor of n by 2 if n is the number of vertices on that cycle. And if it's a path which is an even path, then once again you can get away with exactly half, nothing more. But if it's a path of odd length, then you can get away with the ceiling of n by 2, again assuming that n is the number of vertices on that path. So depending on the situation, you might have to do an appropriate floor or ceiling, go over all the components and add up these values. So that's a legitimate polynomial time algorithm that finds you a maximum independent set when the maximum degree of the graph is at most 2. But now you have an enhanced branching strategy, and you have a better running time, which comes from plugging in now the recurrence t of n is at most t of n minus 1 plus t of n minus 4. And here it turns out that this value improves from 1.46 to the n to 1.38 to the n. if you do the same thing, which is that you write out these equations and solve for the constant c, that's what you get out of it. So I'm not being terribly formal about why these are valid upper bounds. It turns out that once you solve these equations and come up with this value of c, you can basically work your way backwards and write down a proper proof by induction to say that this bound works out. And the reason it works out is because you reverse engineered this value precisely to make an induction argument work. So I'd welcome you to actually, write it out explicitly to convince yourself, or look up the notes where this is done in a little more detail. But hopefully the spirit of, the branching is clear. The idea is that we do an exhaustive recursive algorithm, and we try to be exhaustive in clever ways so that we have some control on the size and the shape of the recursion tree, and hopefully beat the brute force running times by quite a substantial order of magnitude. This is by no means the end of the road for maximum independence set. You can do cleverer branching strategies, more comprehensive case analysis to basically get to significantly better running times, but that's going to be a little out of scope for our discussion. My main intention here was to convey the idea of what a branch and bound algorithm looks like, and now hopefully you have a reasonable sense of what such algorithms do. The state-of-the-art algorithms are typically much more involved in terms of the cases they get into, and you have to typically be careful about two things. One is to ensure that your cases are actually exhaustive, nothing's slipped through the cracks, you've actually accounted for everything. And the other thing, of course, to watch out for is how do these cases come together to give you a nice running time. So in your analysis, you want to be careful about making sure that you're tight in analyzing all the drops in all your branches. So that brings us to the end of the discussion on branch and bound algorithms, and our example endpoint was the independent set problem, but it turns out that this technique is very useful for a number of other problems as well, and we'll encounter them more in the assignments and possibly in the extended course notes as well. Next time, we will look at how we can use a technique that you might remember from high school, which is the inclusion-exclusion principle, to design fun and interesting exact algorithms. So see you in the next video.